Welcome to Deep Green. Today, we're sharing a special episode from Surround Podcast's member show, Architecture 5-10-20 from FXCollaborative. We hope you enjoyed today's episode, and if you do, don't forget to go follow their show, Architecture 5-10-20, wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome to Architecture 5-10-20. I'm your host, Guy Geyer, Managing Partner of FXCollaborative Architects in New York. For our 2025 season, we are looking ahead at the AEC industry's sustainability commitments, many of which have milestones aligned with our 5, 10, and 20-year forecasts. Join us to hear the perspectives of a diverse group of thought leaders as we explore their efforts to address this all-important issue and build a more sustainable future. I am thrilled to have Avi Rajagopal as my guest for this special episode of Architecture 5-10-20, which was recorded live from FXCollaborative's office in Brooklyn, New York, as part of our Green April programming. Avi is the editor-in-chief of Metropolis, a leading magazine showcasing sustainable architecture and design. He is also the host of Deep Green, a podcast about the impact of climate change and equity on the built environment. Architecture 5-10-20 and Deep Green are both members of Surround, a podcast network from Sandow Design Group. This live episode was a fun opportunity for a lively discussion with Avi and my FXCollaborative colleagues, and I hope you enjoy listening. Welcome to episode 4 of the 4th season of Architecture 5-10-20. This season, based on a suggestion from one of last season's guests, we decided to focus on sustainability and resiliency and put together a string of guests to address that for this year. That was tied to the fact we call it Architecture 5-10-20, and in the next 5 and 10 and 20 years, there's a number of milestone dates, Architecture 2030, Paris Accords, other things that are kind of on those milestone dates. We're excited to be doing that this year. So within that context, Avi is my guest for this special episode that we're doing live here from FXCollaborative's gallery space in Brooklyn. So welcome, Avi.
Thank you so much for having me, Guy. It's such a pleasure.
So to get started, can you share a bit about how you got involved in design and also sustainability in your career?
Yeah. It's one of those things that happens when you're, 10, 15, 20 years into your career that you find yourself doing a particular kind of work. And then when you look back, you can kind of build a narrative that the seeds were always there. And so I'm going to do a little bit of that kind of revisionism today. I studied design in India. My specialization was product design, industrial design. And I studied at a school, the National Institute of Design in Ahmedabad, which placed a lot of emphasis on the social and planetary impact of design. There's a long history to that. But when I came to the school, it was considered part of what one did while working on projects. I started in 2002, which was also the year that I think LEED certified their first building. I was studying at a time when formal frameworks around sustainability were kind of emerging within design. I came to New York to SVA to do a master's in design criticism. My graduate thesis stumbled onto sustainability, as it were. It was about actually a cultural analysis of 3D printing, additive manufacturing, and kind of open source and hackable design. One of the things we looked at was how there was this hypothetical linkage of parametric design, digital fabrication, and sustainability. So the theory was that you could build buildings or make objects that were absolute perfect fits for their context. You could manufacture them or build them at a relatively small scale and so on and so forth. You get the idea, right? So some level of sustainability thinking there. But really, I will say the trial by fire was when I started at Metropolis, started as an intern. My first day at the office I joke about this a lot. There were like literal fumes coming out of then editor-in-chief Susan Sinazi's office because she was in the midst of a fight. Frank Gehry had gone on record saying that the sustainability building movement was all bogus and it was just a lot of pushing paper around and moving numbers from column to column. She, of course, was a huge advocate and was very, very mad at that. So Metropolis as a platform was always kind of steeped in that ethos. I like to think of us as a place where we care deeply about the how and why of design. We want to encourage people to build better places and spaces. And one of the ways that you do that, and I think an indelible way, is sustainability. It's kind of, I think at this point, it almost feels like a artificial exercise to separate out thinking about resource use, energy use, and things like that from the basics of putting a building together or a space together. In a way, it's become mainstream, I think, in the way that the first thinkers around sustainability in buildings, formal sustainability in buildings and architecture, really envisioned. That's been great, and I've been able to witness that happen in the industry over the last decade plus, 15 years or so. So in retrospect, I can be like, yes, I've always been interested in sustainability. But the truth of the matter is, like everybody else, I learned as I progressed.
Yeah. And so what do you see both Metropolis's role, but also the role of other publications in sustainability and design and helping us all push the envelope?
First of all, there's a really important role for the media landscape to play within the profession and as an interface of the profession with other stakeholders or other people who have influence on buildings. So as magazines and newspapers and media platforms, we have a responsibility to kind of explain what's possible, then celebrate when people actually achieve those possibilities. So we take that role very seriously. And I think at Metropolis, we also have a very clear understanding of where we fit within that larger landscape. We are a trade publication, so my primary concern is in helping architects, interior designers, landscape architects, others in the built environment do their jobs better. Part of that means that we're sometimes maybe showcasing, I would say, more kind of the leading edge of what's happening on sustainability as with other things. We're interested in the ideas that inform architecture and design, and we're often at the forefront, I would like to think, of bringing up some of those concerns in a way that maybe more popular media doesn't have to. So I think there's a continuum there where we should have trade publications. The way I see it, trade publications help the trades do their job better. And as they do their job better, other publications showcase what happens and they spread the message to others, right? So, I mean, it's great if like the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times have both built up quite a lot of coverage of sustainable architecture over the years. And that's great. But I think of them as they're not necessarily interested in the inner kind of disciplinary concerns that Metropolis
Getting into the details. Yeah. FXCollaborative has had a long relationship with you and Metropolis, and we participated in some think tanks, the Climate Toolkit for Interior Design in 2023, and the Circular Built Environment in 2024. Can you talk a little bit about those efforts and what the results of those efforts were?
Yeah, absolutely. One of our primary bodies of work as Metropolis over the last 5 years has been our work around carbon emissions in interior design. So indulge me for a second. I'll give you some background here.
Sure, go ahead.
2003, Metropolis, we were the first publication to say that the built environment was responsible for carbon emissions and to publish that number that we all use very freely now. 39% of the world's carbon emissions are related to the built environment. I think we said 40% in that article. Ed Masria had this light bulb go off. He was looking at Department of Energy data and he was like, well, if we just look at construction as construction, it's a small piece of the pie. But for instance, the DOE assigned a certain level of carbon emissions to transportation. But there's an enormous amount of transportation that's involved with transporting building materials. If the buildings didn't have to be built, those materials wouldn't have to be transported. So in a way, we're responsible for those transportation emissions. You get what I'm saying? So like he took a pie chart where construction seemed like a small sliver, and then he started to attribute all the parts of other slivers that construction influenced, and then realized we were responsible for a much bigger part of the pie than we thought. We published that in 2003. had been part of that movement. We were involved with the creation of the 2030 commitment back in the day. That legacy was definitely there. When I started at the magazine, we were thinking about sustainability, yes, but it was only in like 2019, 2020 that we started to see some interesting studies happen about interior renovations in particular. And you have to understand, for me as editor-in-chief of publication, I was also seeing the volume of business that was happening on the interior design side. A lot of our advertisers were interior design manufacturers. They were clearly selling a lot of product. All that product must be going somewhere. Why do we need so many new chairs every year? Why do we need so much new textile every year, so much new wall covering every year? And it never quite added up for me that when people were doing what they called whole building life cycle assessments, they would assign 2% or 3% of a building's emissions to interiors. And I was like, if it's so small, how come so much stuff is being sold? Like, how are people making so much money selling stuff, but it only accounts for this tiny little sliver in our industry? It never made sense to me. And then we started to see some studies that brought out numbers. And of course, the trick of it is that interiors cycle in and out of buildings at quite alarming rate. I mean, this podcast is called 5, 10, 20, and that actually lines up, and we're going to talk about that, lines up quite well with how often interiors are pulled out of buildings, right?
Yeah, because leases are usually 5, 10, or 15,
right,
20-year
exactly.
leases, and
lines
every
right
time they roll over, something happens.
Right, exactly. And so that was the insight we had. And we were like, wait a second. So if you started to look at emissions not as an annual number, but as emissions over the life of a building, which is what, by the way, a whole building life cycle assessment is supposed to do, but very rarely does, you would see that all that stuff cycling in and out of buildings makes a huge difference. And by some estimates, it could be almost a quarter of a building's embodied carbon emissions by the end of its life, especially if it's an office building with a lot of tenancy turnover and so on and so forth. Having stumbled on that information, we published an article about it. We said, interior designers, your time is now. You need to step into the fray. Like, let's do this. And we were like, okay, we can't just put the data out there and then just sit back. Because, of course, I had this legacy of Susan and others at Metropolis taking on advocacy once they had published their story. So I was like, okay, I have something to live up to. I got to do this. We got to get this rolling. We convened a whole bunch of folks, including folks from FXCollaborative. 68 people, I think, were involved to create the Climate Toolkit for interior design, which was like, okay, knowing what we know and knowing that we don't know some stuff, what is the first preliminary advice we can give to interior designers? That toolkit, we then took on the road. We vetted it with lots of firms across the country. We released a much more streamlined and more definitive version last year. That's the Climate Toolkit for interior design. As we were working through that process, one thing became very clear, that the lowering of carbon emissions on interiors, embodied carbon emissions, I mean, on interiors as with everything else, the biggest contributor there, of course, was waste, right? So if you didn't throw out stuff, you wouldn't pile up those carbon emissions quite so fast. It's quite simple. And so it seemed like the number one thing we should be looking at is how do we not throw away so much stuff? And so our interest in circularity started to grow there. Last year, we brought together, again, similarly, a whole bunch of people across the industry and said, okay, we don't need to create a toolkit because there are some very good toolkits out there. The Ellen MacArthur Foundation and Arup created a circular buildings toolkit a few years ago. The toolkit exists, but how can we use the toolkit to imagine different futures for the built environment? So we gave people some really fun prompts. Like one group was, how do you fight the culture of the new? One group was asked, how do we question models of ownership in the built environment? We thought very long and hard about what are the levers that if we kind of toggled them, we could achieve real change in the built environment. So that's what the 7 proposals were. It's a lot of fun. We ended up with some great ideas, new professions that we need in the built environment, like a material steward or things like that. Basically thinking what new jobs we would need if we were to take this idea of circularity seriously. Lots of things like that. We looked at how can we expand our framework for circularity in structural steel, for example. We looked at, okay, so we want to reuse all this material. This is actually a huge problem. All of us have the intention, okay, we're not going to keep buying stuff. We're going to reuse old stuff. All right. But who vouches for the quality of that old stuff? How do we assess that old stuff so we know that it's going to perform in buildings, that it doesn't have toxic chemicals in it? Great. You want to use that chair from like 1960, whatever. How do you know that it doesn't have substances in it that are actually banned or controlled, or we know our concerns for health today. We developed a rough framework for assessment of existing building materials and components. Lots of different ideas like that came out of that. I find that work really exciting to do because we see our role as a kind of node or hub for generating new information or knowledge for the building industry. And anywhere we can help do that, we want to do that.
Could you just highlight a few, in your opinion, the things that designers, architects can do that are specific changes in behavior, changes in attitude about what we do to address circularity and sustainability?
There's different tiers of action we can take very instrumentally in buildings. If we were to look just as materials, I think the most climate-friendly way to design would be, if you're considering a material, is to not to use it in the first place. A good example is flooring. Do you need new flooring in the space? Can you just refinish, right? Like, can you do with less surfaces, right? So that kind of questioning, what can you avoid, I think is one. The second is, what can you reuse? What can you use that's already existing in the space? What networks can we create to find used material or salvaged material, bring it back into the built environment? That would be a huge impact. I think third order impact is, if you're buying new, if you've decided it has to be in there and I can't reuse something, I have to buy something new, is to really look closely at the impact of the thing that you're buying new to make sure that it has hopefully some redeeming qualities when it comes to carbon emissions. So like it's renewable in some way, or it's regenerative in some way. So it's made out of some sort of bio-based material and you're able to think through how that bio-based material is created and so on. So number 4 then goes looking for EPDs. I feel like in the industry, sometimes we start with record EPDs. EPDs are environmental product declarations. They're the piece of paper that says what the carbon emissions of any given building or product have. Sometimes we use that as a mantra, like find the EPDs. But there's so much you can do before you ever get to the stage of needing to look at an EPD to find out what the emissions of a product are. There's so many commonsensical things we could be doing. Underlying all of that is a change in mindset about how we think about materials and assemblies. Specifically, when we talk about embodied carbon emissions, I think that's the biggest difference is, how do we start to think about materials not as depreciating assets, but as investments? How do we think about materials not as use and throw, but rather as use, reuse, reuse, reuse? How do we think about materials whose origin is regenerative, not extractive? There are so many lenses you can apply to how we approach materials and assemblies in a building. Those things make a big difference. I'm sorry, it's not very practical advice, but you have to start at the level of what is your mindset and your approach to design as an activity, really, if you want to start to make some big changes in embodied carbon emissions.
Yeah, that's great. You just got back from Salone del Mobile in Milan, which is always a fabulous show, but you get to go all the time. In any case, I'm curious what you saw there that may be different than what we see here relative to circularity, and also what you observed or are observing in other markets, global markets, even across this country, different markets here in terms of their commitment to this.
I think there's a couple of things. I don't know that they're markedly different from what we see here, but just in general, a little more appetite for experimentation with aesthetics. And it's weird, I know, talking about sustainability and starting with aesthetics, but in this country, I don't know how to say this, but if I were to say, imagine what a super sustainable office looks like, and I say, imagine what a super swanky, high budget office looks like, you would imagine two very different things. We have this aesthetic that's associated with sustainability in a way. But the first thing I encourage people to remember is that aesthetics is not linked with sustainability in the way that you think. Just because something looks natural or has a lot of natural materials doesn't mean that it's automatically more sustainable than any other kind of space. It can be, provided you've taken those decisions carefully. The one thing that I see in spaces in Europe or elsewhere is a willingness to play around with that a little bit. What's common is, I think, in manufacturing of materials and products, at least the larger brands are continue to make huge investments in retooling their manufacturing process. There's lots going on. Everybody at Milan was talking about recycled content in their product, or bio-based this or bio-sourced that or whatever. And I think that's fantastic. That's true here as well. I mean, there's lots of options available. The last thing I will say is that I was reminded of this in Milan. Our relationship to manufacturing as an activity. I think in Europe and in other parts of the world, especially India, where I come from, Mexico, Peru, I saw lots of great exhibits of artisanship and craft and how that's still a mainstream part of the built environment in a way that we've kind of lost that connection here in the United States. And I think as we think more seriously about sustainability, rebuilding that relationship of the hand and material and being able to see human activity, community benefit, all those things that quote unquote craft or pre-modern manufacturing techniques, pre-industrialized manufacturing techniques embedded into buildings. I think seeing that connection rebuilt in this country would be great.
Yeah, that's really very interesting to hear. We talk a lot about craft here and how buildings are put together and how interiors are put together. So to hear that is really important. Do you see variations across various types of markets, from corporate workplace projects to residential to hospitality? Do you see different attitudes from your viewpoint?
Absolutely. Doing the work that we've done on interiors actually really has emphasized that for me. How different types of buildings are in the ways that they grow and age over time. If I can make one recommendation, and I make this all the time, if I can make one recommendation for a book that people should revisit, it's How Buildings Learn by Stuart Brand. If you haven't read it, go back, read it. If you don't want to read it, there's a YouTube series available for free. BBC made this documentary on the book in the 90s. It's absolutely fantastic because it reminds us that actually buildings are not static objects, that they actually have a life, that over a period of time they change. And different types of buildings have different appetites and pathways for change. So think about it. An office building with tenancy, obviously it makes sense. People are going to cycle in and out of the building. Every time somebody new comes in, they're going to want to do something different in the space, right? That's human nature. They're going to throw stuff out, bring new stuff in. That level of change is going to be rapid. But at the same time, because of the corporate culture we've built around sustainability and so on, companies are more concerned a little bit with what they do in their offices. And so they've made that connection. Whereas now, if I look at something like a healthcare facility, it's not renovated in the same way. Large healthcare facilities are renovated piecemeal because you can't you can't shut down large parts of a hospital for long periods of time. You can do it bit by bit. So facilities managers and operators in hospitals, they have their own cycle of how they maintain materials. It's not to throw everything out and bring new stuff in. It's little by little, little by little. So the way you think about interior churn in a hospital is very different. And then, of course, the connection of those materials and that churn to human well-being and health has a completely different meaning in a hospital than it does in a commercial building. So yes, huge variations. There's a reason why we don't have LEED Platinum hospitals yet. Not that LEED Platinum is the only standard for sustainability, but there's a reason. It's very, very hard to do because those standards, our frameworks are set for baseline commercial buildings. They are very tough to implement when we implement them for other typologies.
So I'm going to turn this over to questions and answers from the audience, but I want to ask you one more question, which is just, we've named the podcast Architecture 5-10-20 because we want to talk about the future. What are some of the key things that you see coming down the road for sustainability, resiliency, circularity?
I should preface this by saying I'm an optimist. So I tend to have
You're not alone. I think architects are by definition optimists. Right?
Yeah, in what we do, if you don't believe in the future, it's very hard to do the jobs that we do. Within that framework, I will say hopeful signs already. Retrofits, renovations continue to be somewhere around half of billings for American architecture firms. This has been true for the last several years. It'll continue to be true. I think it means that we're taking a more sober approach to ground-up construction. We're thinking about our buildings as viable, valuable objects and assets, and that value can be recouped over time. Hopefully, we'll also start thinking about how buildings learn. Sorry, I had to plug that again. We'll start to design accordingly. So I think I'm very hopeful that we're moving towards a much more mutable, organic sense of how the built environment evolves over time. That's one thing I'm hopeful for. And I think there's plenty of signs of that already. In 5 years, just look at New York. Large buildings are going to have to start reporting carbon emissions as of this year. That's going to spread. Once you start paying attention to that stuff, you're going to start paying attention to waste. Then you start thinking about how buildings operate in very different ways. So I think in 5 years, we'll already get someplace. The other is the mainstreaming of what we still think of as unconventional materials. So cellulose insulation or mineral wool insulation or other sorts of biogenic or earth-based materials coming into the buildings and the built environment and becoming more mainstream. I think that's only going to grow. There's plenty of great case studies out there. FXCollaborative, you yourselves have done so much of that great work. The other thing is that I'm really hopeful for, and I think is going to happen, is we're getting better at thinking about the built environment's impact on human beings, not just on the occupants of buildings, but on communities and the larger network of human beings that are involved with the built environment at large. By that, I mean the people who work in the factories that produce the building materials that land up on a construction site. All the people we've not always thought of when we were designing buildings, I think we're getting better at looking at those people. And I think another thing that FXCollaborative has led on, I think, in many ways, is thinking about non-human life on this planet and its connection to the built environment. Your firm's work on how we think about birds and other species in cities, absolutely groundbreaking. There's plenty of other folks like you who are thinking about that a lot. And I think it just reminds us that humans aren't the only people affected by the built environment. We build this dichotomy of human and nature. We are nature ourselves, and we share this planet with lots of other species, and they are all impacted by what we do in the built environment. So I'm excited to see that grow and develop. So I would say 5 years, get better at treating the built environment as a resource. Maybe 10 years, we'll mainstream more exciting regenerative materials. And then hopefully in 20 years, we're not thinking only about human beings when we design buildings.
That's awesome. Thank you. So I'm going to open it up. Does anybody have a question for Avi?
That was really great, Avi. Thank you so much. I thought you framed it so beautifully. What I want to talk to you about is your observation about the 50% invoicing for reuse versus new build and the changing mindset of the designer in regards to that. I was at a group discussion about this with some folks, and somebody from Columbia's preservation department said they routinely go on architects' firms' websites and try to reconcile that observation of the 50% versus what they're promoting as what we do, and basically that the adaptive reuse and the reuse and so forth are really treated as second-class citizens, that the projects are not celebrated, and that there's also the way they termed it was there was a certain degree of shame about these projects. And I was wondering, as your perch at Metropolis, do you see this? How do you see it? And what do you see as a change agent in terms of that?
I absolutely love this question. I have a response, but I'm going to caveat the response by first saying that at Metropolis, and for me personally, we've been on that adaptive reuse bandwagon, and I've kind of come out the other side now. So I'm sorry. So for instance, just a few months ago, so we've been doing this thing at Metropolis where we're diving into our archives on our website and putting together article collections, because we find that we've tracked a trend over, several years or whatever, and it's not easy to always find everything about a particular topic. My team put together a list of maybe like 50 or 60 adaptive reuse projects that we've covered over the last 5 or 6 years. And we picked the 32 best, and we put it together as a single page where you can go look at all of those articles together. That culture shift is happening. People do celebrate their adaptive reuse work. I think they should do more of that. I think it's a skill that, is really important. When I said, we've come out the other side, what I mean is Carl Elefante was fond of saying this: the greenest building is the one that already exists. And he was right to some degree, because adaptive reuse is really important. We shouldn't be throwing buildings away. We should be reusing buildings, yes. But that depends on how you reuse the building. So you can't say adaptive reuse is great if your adaptive reuse process is taking everything that's in the inside of the building, chucking it and stuffing it with new stuff every single time. Because now we know that churn of stuff inside a building is actually consequential from an embodied carbon emissions perspective. So that's been one outpost of our work on interiors, is we're saying, we don't want adaptive reuse, I want adaptable reuse, right? So what you were talking about, thinking about multiple case studies or use cases for a building, that long life loose fit. Buildings should have a loose fit to their program, because, over time, that building might have many different programs in it. And if changing the program in a building requires humanity to make a huge investment in terms of resources every single time, then that's not great. If we have to go through all this effort to make buildings work again. So that's a problem. So adaptable reuse is one side of it. The other thing I will say is play this out culturally. The majority of our work becomes retrofit and renovation. Imagine then culturally what a huge privilege it would be when you get to design a building ground up. The stars come together in some way. There's like some configuration, every calculator, you've done every calculation, you've penciled everything out. You realize that you got to build ground up. I think we have to recognize that building ground up is a huge privilege from a planetary point of view. It's like such a huge privilege. We get to marshal the Earth's resources to create a building. That should be a once in a few years thing for an architecture firm, honestly, or it will become. So I don't see us celebrating ground up buildings less. I see us celebrating ground up buildings more because they're going to become rarer to do if we really assign the true cost of resources to the construction process. So I don't think firm websites are going to change, unfortunately, because it's going to, I mean, no matter how you think about it, actually creating a building from the ground up is going to be that crowning achievement, I think, for an architecture firm by and by. But at the same time, we have to celebrate the actual work that we do. And I think there's a lot of that going on. I mean, your website celebrates plenty of adaptive reuse work, and plenty of others do too.
There's a new strain of liberalism, progressivism, sustainability that's supply side progressivism or progressivism that builds. Sometimes they call it YIMBYism. You might call it the politics of abundance. There's a lot of new people writing books, having podcasts about it right now, thinking about this, saying that our fear of new and our just association that building new, it's inherently, from a carbon point of view, a problem. By the way, I love the fact that the magazine itself is called Metropolis. It's thinking at the bigger scale and then also working at the finer grain. I'm just wondering how you are coming to terms with those two different viewpoints of sustainability. We should be new or we should be continuing to reuse the old. Is there enough square footage available to supply enough homes, to build enough power, to build enough rail systems to actually have a greener future? Can we do it with just the carbon that's already been extracted from the earth? I'm just wondering how the magazine and editorials are sort of responding to this new kind of sustainability.
Yeah, the problem is that, a lot elides in that word new. And I think if you look at Abundance, the new Ezra Klein book, or all of these new frameworks around building, I don't think we can stop by saying we should say yes to the new. I think it's new what is the question. So unfortunately, the things that we say yes to for new so far tend to be things that don't have a very big impact on society or the world. Yes, XYZ company gets to build their third new headquarters, right? Or fourth new headquarters somewhere. And sometimes it's adaptive reuse, sometimes it's ground up construction. People get to build a new museum. People get to build all this privileged stuff, which is great. But I think what is the balance of that with, say, building new housing? Then when we build new housing, it's like market rate housing, or, I used to joke, like, how can every apartment in New York be luxury housing? I lived in Bushwick 5 years ago, and we wanted to move to a new place, and we started looking at apartments in the neighborhood, and I was like, I cannot. Basically, I should live in a matchbox, pay, $3,000 for it because there's a shower for my pets in the basement. It just doesn't make any sense to me. And so I think it's not about new, it's about what new. And I think as a society, that's also part of that abundance argument, right? It's like there's abundance to do the things that make a real difference, right? Whatever we culturally decide we need to make a difference to. That's the problem. Still, most construction, when our culture says downtown is the hub of commercial activity, construction concentrates downtown. When our culture says downtowns are gritty and horrible and you meet homeless people, so we should move out to the suburbs, the construction moves to the suburbs, right? But the people who get to construct are still the same people. It's not, like they move, but the actual locus of who gets to fund construction never moves. And I think that's the question is, yes, build new, but can other people get a chance to build new as well? Or are we just going to let the same few developer companies go around the rounds again, right? Their grandfathers got to build, and their fathers got to build, now they get to build, and their sons will get to build, right? Great, right? So what have we changed? So who are we saying yes to? That's the question.
One answer to that question is actually in the Metropolis proposals for circular design, the super dense commercial building, which makes a lot of sense because at our office, we focus on urbanism because that's the efficient way to house growing population. Can you expand on the super dense commercial building?
Yeah, that's actually maybe my favorite of the proposals. It's not the most flashy of the proposals. Basically, we asked people to question ownership, and they said, one way to think about reducing the carbon emissions of the built environment is to not build new, yes. But also, are we getting the most bang out of every ton of carbon we're putting in the atmosphere for a building? How do we make sure that we are utilizing buildings to the highest extent possible? I mean, still in the United States, utilization rates for commercial buildings, we know it hovers around 50%. We build buildings, then we don't use them at their optimal level. Part of our responsibility is how do we build buildings that can then be used to the maximum extent possible? That was what that idea is about. So it was can the same space be shared by multiple people? Can some people in a building have a 5-year lease and some people in a building have a 2-day lease? What would that do to the maintenance structure, ownership structure for the building? Who's responsible for what? What rules would apply to tenants in terms of what they're allowed to bring into a building or what they're allowed to throw out? Who is doing the allowing? Is it a social contract among whoever are the tenants in the building at the moment? Is there a trust or a governing body, kind of like a co-op of an apartment building? Is there a co-op of a commercial building? So the idea is, if we start to question some of these things, we can build, and then what we build is precious. It's a great opportunity that we got to build. Now we're going to use the heck out of that building, and we're going to use it in the most responsible way possible, in the densest way possible, right? That's great then. So say yes to that. But the problem is that we build a lot of housing where the housing sits vacant. We build a lot of office space where the office space is not utilized to its greatest extent possible. We're lighting spaces that we're not using densely, air conditioning them and all of this stuff. So there's implications for carbon emissions all around if we don't use a building to its maximum possible extent. That's the other part of it, is what do we build? What do we say yes to? And then once we've said yes, are we fulfilling our contract to the planet and to other life on this planet in terms of how that building is then used? And this is not just the work of architects. I'm sorry. It's about everybody involved in the built environment, including clients and brokers and real estate folks and developers. I get that. That's a big picture thing. But yeah.
Great. On that note, I would like to thank Avi again and thank all of you for participating in our first live podcast session. It's been great having you on board, and thanks so much for coming.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
My colleagues at FXCollaborative and I were deeply inspired by Avi's advocacy for a sustainable and circular built environment and thoughtful framing of the issues facing our industry. We look forward to continuing to build upon our collaboration with Metropolis as we work towards a circular future. Thank you for listening to the Architecture 51020 podcast, a member of the Surround Podcast Network. Learn more at surroundpodcasts.com. I'm your host, Guy Geyer. Stay tuned as we continue our journey into the future over the next 5, 10, and 20 years. Don't miss out. Subscribe to our podcast and find us on social media using the handle @ARC51020FXC. And if you want to learn more about our guest today, access show notes and resources, be sure to visit www.fxcollaborative.com/ARC51020.